This is it. The first American commercial jet capable of economical transatlantic service. The Boeing 707 Jet Clipper.
No, it was just plain people with dedication and skill who were really responsible for the 747. And on September the 30th, 1968, the 747 was rolled out of the factory.
The new Boeing 737 was the product of close cooperation between Boeing and Lufthansa.
For over 100 years, Boeing has built an immense reputation for itself and set the standard for passenger safety in air travel by under no circumstances putting the safety of its passengers and the engineering of its aircraft before anything else inside the company. The inherent trust that exists between passengers and airlines has long been assumed and overlooked. Boeing emerged as a leading figure in this trust dynamic, with passengers expressing their confidence by saying, "If it ain't a Boeing, I ain't going." And in an industry where something as simple as a loose bolt or faulty sensor can bring a plane down from the sky, cause countless fatalities and ground an entire fleet of aircraft for nearly 2 years, can there really be any margin for error? Well, for over the last few decades, the business culture at Boeing has slowly been evolving and has gone from this.
I like to come to work. I like to keep the cogs on this machine rolling.
Every single one of those airplanes has a piece of everybody that's ever done any job on that.
To former employees saying this.
Would you fly in a Boeing 737?
I've flown 737s my whole life. I will not step on a mat.
This brings us to one serious question. Who is in charge at Boeing? Is engineering and quality still at the top of their priorities, or have Boeing lost their way and fallen foul to cost cutting and shifted its focus onto appeasing its investors on Wall Street, which many people may believe? This is another business theory and we're looking at where Boeing is going. Boeing was founded in 1916 by William E. Boeing and began as the Pacific Aero Products Company in Seattle, Washington. It was renamed Boeing Airplane Company in 1917 and it later evolved into Boeing Airplane and Transportation Corporation in 1928. In 1934, the US government implemented antitrust laws that required aircraft manufacturing to be separate from air transportation. And as a result, Boeing Airplane Company had to divest its airline operations, creating United Airlines as a separate entity. The company is diversified into various industries, including helicopters with the acquisition of Vertol Aircraft Corporation in 1960. And in 1958, Boeing brought its first commercial and narrow-body airliner, the 707, to service for passenger transport. Although it wasn't the first, it was the most popular and many believed it marked the start of the jet age. For over 100 years, they've always under no circumstances shifted from its position in quality and passenger safety. So where exactly has all of this gone wrong? Many believe that Boeing's shifting priorities can be traced back to its merger with Mcdonnell Douglas back in 1997. Mcdonnell Douglas faced stiff competition from Boeing and Airbus and suffered losses in military contracts after the end of the Cold War. With no money to invest in research and development, their only way out really was to merge with Boeing. This decision was disastrous for Boeing. Following the merger, Boeing's leadership was replaced by Mcdonnell Douglas's former directors, all of which had a desire to make the company a good stock and more appealable to Wall Street. And consequently, Boeing's core belief system, shaped by its engineers, came under the control of directors whose focus was more on cutting costs and increasing the company's profits. These new leaders were accountants, financial controllers and cost-conscious managers, and over time eroded Boeing's long-standing commitment to engineering excellence and reputation. Shortly after, Boeing let go of thousands of employees and moved all its senior management away from the production line in Seattle to Chicago, over 2,000 miles away. By doing this, management could start to make financial decisions without any direct pushback or interference from its engineers, the ones who actually build the planes. By the early 2000s, sales on the 767 and 747 were in decline, and the market was slowly shifting towards fuel efficiency rather than speed, following the aftermath of 9/11 and rising fuel costs. In response to this, Boeing announced the 787 program on 29th of January 2003, which later became known as the 787 Dreamliner. Harry Stonecipher, the newly employed CEO from Mcdonnell Douglas, issued an ultimatum to its developers. They were To develop the plane for less than 40% of what the 777 cost to develop 13 years previous, and then build each plane out of the gate for less than 60% of the 777's unit costs in 2003. The approach Boeing utilised to keep its development costs low was by persuading its top suppliers to cover the expenses for all the research and development. This strategy involved subcontractors funding the development of various parts of the aircraft on their own. These subcontractors were motivated by the prospects of securing contracts with Boeing, the largest aircraft supplier in the world globally at the time. This idea was stemmed from Mcdonnell Douglas's previously failed attempt at building a plane from the same way before its merger with Boeing. It was known as the MD-95, but once Boeing acquired Mcdonnell Douglas for $13 billion, it was changed to the 717 program. This plane was a complete flop, and only 144 were ever produced, costing the suppliers billions of dollars with no returns. But, with this clearly not in mind, they approved a development budget of just $7 billion. So, what would Boeing's involvement be in all of this? All the completed sub-assemblies would be shipped to their assembly line in Everett, Washington for final assembly and get a nice big Boeing sticker on the front. This proved to be yet again another terrible move because there was no control over the quality of the parts, so there was just problem after problem. The aircraft was 3 years late in production, engines caught fire on test flights, and when it was commercially ready the lithium-ion batteries had an overheating problem and set fire and subsequently grounded all the planes for a month in 2013 until the problem was fixed. These shady attempts by Boeing to cut corners and reduce costs ultimately proved even more costly, with the project exceeding its budget by $30 billion, and some suggest that Boeing would need to sell up to 2,000 units of the aircraft just to break even. Meanwhile, while the 787 issues were unravelling, Airbus shocked everybody in 2010 by announcing something that would shake Boeing's ability to remain competitive to the core. In December 2010, Airbus announced a very simple upgrade to its A320 model of planes, installing the new CFM LEAP 1 engines to its planes, which were 10 to 15% more efficient and required next to no pilot training to get flying. This became known as the A320neo, which stands for New Engine Option. Airliners spend around 30% of their total revenue on fuel per year, so a saving of 15% was a huge breakthrough. Airbus received nearly 1,200 orders in its first year. American Airlines had previously exclusively operated Boeing planes. However, they were enticed by the cost savings provided by the A320neo, and they expressed their intention to purchase 400 planes. Before finalising this significant order, they approached Boeing with the proposition. If Boeing could match Airbus in terms of efficiency with a new plane, they would split the order between the two manufacturers. Boeing, with their resources tied up in the 787 debacle and rapidly losing market share on their most profitable aircraft to Airbus, rose to the challenge and chose to take the quickest and cheapest option to make a further iteration to their already aging 737 planes, naming it the 737 MAX and using the same CFM LEAP 1 engines as the Airbus. However, these larger engines wouldn't fit under the 737's wings because of its low ground clearance and necessitating adjustments to the plane's design. This involved moving the engines forward and higher up on the wing, and as a result the aircraft became slightly more unstable, leading to increased nose-up pitching during takeoff and the potential for engines to stall. To address this issue, Boeing estimated it would cost around $1 million per aircraft to fix and would also require regulatory simulation training for pilots. To avoid any necessary regulations from the FAA, Boeing introduced software called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, or MCAS, to the plane systems. MCAS relies on a single sensor located at the nose of the plane, known as the angle of attack sensor. If the sensor detected that the plane was pitching too high, it would trigger the MCAS system to intervene. The MCAS system would then adjust the plane's pitch, or angle of ascent, by modifying the position of the rear vertical stabilizer. This correction would help the level of the plane to prevent a potential stall.
A Lion Air Boeing 737 MAX 8 carrying 189 people crashed into the sea this morning. Rescuers have located debris, but they do not expect to find any survivors.
It was this single sensor that malfunctioned on both Lion Air Flight 610 and Ethiopian Airlines Flight 302, leading them to nosedive uncontrollably into the ground and led to the tragic death of 346 people. And that subsequently led to a 20-month grounding of the 737 MAX plane and an investigation into Boeing. The ramifications of the aftermath was absolutely catastrophic. They lost hundreds of orders, totaling around $20 billion, and all production was stopped until the investigation was finished. This led to a criminal investigation which uncovered that Boeing executives had intentionally concealed information about the MCAS system to the FAA and removed all mention of it from the pilot's operations manual, which the pilots heavily rely on. And to avoid any criminal charges within the company, they agreed to pay a $2.5 billion settlement, which went to the airliners for loss of revenue and the victims' families. But how could all of these problems have happened in the first place? When building the planes, why weren't these quality issues picked up by the engineers? Well, the truth is, they were. But the culture at Boeing had changed so much that it had become under complete control of corporate culture, and the engineers have been silenced completely. Engineers and management at Boeing all feared bringing up any quality issues over the fear of losing their job. Any engineers who did bring up the quality issues were told to keep any mentions of it strictly in person to avoid a paper trail. And even then, they were ignored and nothing was done at all, because it had made promises to its investors and needed to meet its schedules to keep them happy. Boeing went as far as building a second 787 manufacturing plant in South Carolina to avoid any scrutiny by unions in Washington, as South Carolina isn't a unionized state and they had free reign of their quality control. It was all about getting the planes out of the door as quickly as possible to meet its deadlines. The most recent incident on March 11, 2024 involving a 787 and Dreamliner exemplifies the significant lapse in quality control. During the flight, the aircraft suddenly dropped 500 feet from the sky, causing the pilot to lose all controls momentarily. Allegedly, this incident occurred due to a faulty rocker switch and the cover located on the back of the pilot's chair. This switch is designed to move the chair out of the way for pilots to easily access it without climbing over equipment. And according to reports from the online equivalent of Times Square, the switch was accidentally pressed by one of the flight crew while handing food over to the pilot, and as a result, the pilot was pushed into the control yoke, inadvertently disengaging the autopilot, and by the time the autopilot was disengaged, the control yoke had been pushed so far forward to initiate a nosedive into the plane. And yet another incident highlighting the lack of quality control occurred when the door plug blew off an Alaskan Airlines flight during takeoff on a brand new 737 MAX plane. Investigations revealed that the issue stemmed from the need to replace rivets around the door, prompting the removal of the door plug. However, during reassembly, the bolts securing the door plug were not properly reattached. This is an oversight that led to the door plug being dislodged during the flight. Boeing has subsequently paid $160 million to Alaskan Airlines as its initial compensation for the door blowout incident. Thankfully, none of these incidents have resulted in fatalities. However, they underscore the seriousness of cutting corners and prioritising profits over the safety and engineering integrity in such a crucial industry where precision is paramount. And the growing number of whistleblowers within the company strongly suggests that it may not be adequately addressing employee grievances. If the company were truly attentive to its employees, one would wonder why whistleblowers are feeling compelled to speak out in the first place. The series of incidents has cast serious doubts about the safety of Boeing aircraft, tarnishing the reputation of the company it has built over the last 100 years. Corporate greed has led to compromises in safety, causing significant damage to Boeing's credibility. Rebuilding trust will be a daunting task, as it will require extensive efforts to regain the confidence that took decades to establish.